You see what I mean?
Boy, things have changed for you the last few years, haven't you?
On paper, it had all the ingredients for one of the greatest nights in late-night television history. Two giants of American entertainment were about to share the same stage, live, with millions watching and absolutely no room for mistakes. Behind the desk sat Johnny Carson, television's king of cool. Carson had built his reputation on being almost impossible to rattle. Drunken guests, collapsing sets, unruly animals, technical disasters. He could handle nearly anything without losing that effortless smile.
I make fun, but that's why I get paid.
Yes, I understand that.
To jest.
And you've been doing very well.
Jesting is my life.
You moved me right off the front page.
He was disciplined, controlled, and so calm under pressure that even genuine chaos often looked harmless once Johnny took command of it. Across from him was supposed to be one of his closest friends and one of the biggest entertainers alive, Jerry Lewis. At his peak, Lewis had been a phenomenon. He was a box office monster, a master of physical comedy, and a performer capable of making an audience erupt simply by twisting his face, changing his voice, or stumbling across a room. Putting Carson and Lewis together should have been television gold. Instead, millions of viewers watched something far more uncomfortable unfold. Almost from the moment Jerry Lewis stepped through those famous multicolored curtains, something felt wrong. The atmosphere inside the studio didn't simply change, it seemed to collapse. The audience had expected the lovable lunatic they knew from the movies. The rubber-faced clown, the high-pitched troublemaker, the nutty professor who could turn something as simple as sitting in a chair into comedy. But the man walking toward Johnny Carson's desk looked nothing like that familiar character. Jerry was sweating heavily. His movements carried a restless, almost frantic energy.
I have a message for you from Sinatra.
Yes?
He sends the grand thanks.
Knocking him off the
us,
front
yes.
page. Yeah.
His eyes seemed unable to settle on Johnny, the cameras, or even the audience. They moved constantly around the room, giving him an intensity that felt less playful than unpredictable. And perhaps most disturbing of all, Johnny Carson appeared to notice immediately. For a man who had spent decades making uncomfortable situations look effortless, Carson suddenly seemed unusually cautious. His posture changed. His expression tightened. Instead of leaning toward his longtime friend, Johnny appeared to create distance between them. For once, the king of late night didn't look completely in control. He looked like a man trying to figure out what was about to happen. And what followed wasn't simply an awkward celebrity interview. It became a strange, increasingly hostile confrontation involving two men who supposedly knew each other better than almost anyone in Hollywood. The jokes became sharper, the pauses became longer. Moments that should have produced laughter instead created uncomfortable silence. What viewers had expected to be a reunion between two entertainment legends began feeling like they were watching a friendship unravel in public. And there may have been far more happening behind Jerry Lewis's behavior than audiences understood at the time.
My father taught me about the importance of respecting your audience.
Lewis had spent years dealing with severe physical pain, exhausting work schedules, powerful medication, and the enormous pressure that came with protecting the image of Jerry Lewis, the comedy genius who always had to control the room. That night, however, the control seemed to be slipping. This wasn't the polished Jerry Lewis audiences remembered. It wasn't the perfectly timed comedian who knew exactly when to exaggerate a reaction or stretch a joke for another laugh. Something felt unpredictable, and Johnny Carson seemed to sense the danger before anyone else. To understand how quickly the situation deteriorated, you have to understand just how enormous Jerry Lewis still was during this period. By the mid-1970s, he had already spent decades as one of the most recognizable entertainers in America. Generations had watched him alongside Dean Martin and later as the star of his own wildly successful films.
They take an artery out of your leg and they graft it to the heart.
When Doc Severinson's band hit the opening notes and the applause sign lit up, the studio audience knew exactly what they expected. They wanted Jerry Lewis the clown. They wanted the crossed eyes, the ridiculous voices, the exaggerated movements, and the controlled chaos that had made him famous. They were ready to laugh before he even reached the chair. But Jerry didn't enter the studio like a comedian enjoying an adoring crowd. According to accounts surrounding the appearance, his energy seemed unusual almost immediately. Rather than strolling onto the set and soaking up the applause, he appeared restless and intensely wound up. The sweating was impossible to ignore. Despite the cool temperature inside the television studio, Jerry looked visibly uncomfortable. His attention moved rapidly around the set. Instead of calmly connecting with Johnny and allowing the interview to begin, he seemed almost unable to settle into the moment. Johnny Carson was exceptionally good at reading people. Years of interviewing unpredictable celebrities had taught him when to push, when to joke, and most importantly, when to back away. Watch Carson carefully during those opening moments, and his reaction tells its own story. Johnny leans back. The distance between them grows. His pencil remains in his hand, almost like a small barrier, while he studies the man sitting opposite him.
Don't walk out on that stage believing they'll be there because you're there. Bull.
This wasn't Carson enthusiastically welcoming an old friend. It looked more like Carson preparing himself for whatever might happen next. Because somewhere underneath the tuxedo, the jokes, and the familiar Jerry Lewis smile was a man who seemed dangerously close to losing control. And Johnny Carson was sitting only a few feet away when it happened. Millions of Americans were about to discover that the Jerry Lewis they thought they knew could disappear almost instantly. Behind the beloved clown was another personality, angrier, more complicated, and far more volatile. The tension inside the studio didn't simply increase, it became poisonous. And for the millions watching from home, there was suddenly an uncomfortable sense that this appearance was heading somewhere nobody had expected. Normally, Johnny Carson was the ultimate safety net. He had spent years mastering the art of rescuing guests from disaster. If a comedian delivered a joke that died, Johnny could raise an eyebrow, make himself the punchline, or fire off a quick remark that transformed an embarrassing silence into laughter. He understood timing better than almost anyone in television, and even the worst interview could usually be saved once Carson decided to take control. But Jerry Lewis was becoming impossible to rescue. Instead of recognizing that the audience was uncomfortable and trying to win them back, Jerry seemed to turn against them. His material became increasingly confrontational. When the laughter wasn't strong enough, he appeared irritated, almost as though the audience had failed him. These weren't simply viewers anymore. Jerry treated them like employees who weren't performing their assigned job. Laugh, applaud. Give Jerry Lewis the reaction Jerry Lewis expected. And when they didn't, the mood grew even darker.
They're there because they want to see you, and you better treat it with infinite dignity.
Then came a moment that pushed the discomfort to another level. Jerry moved into ethnic humor, including a derogatory joke aimed at Polish people. Even by the looser standards of 1970s television, the material landed badly. The studio went painfully quiet. Imagine hundreds of people arriving expecting to watch one of America's greatest comedians and suddenly realizing they didn't know whether they were supposed to laugh, gasp, or simply sit perfectly still. There was no warmth behind the joke, no playful wink suggesting everyone was in on it. The humor felt bitter and strangely aggressive, as though Jerry wasn't performing for the audience anymore. He was challenging them, and their silence became the loudest response of the night.
And you go out on that stage for one purpose. That's to entertain that audience.
Normally, this was exactly when Carson would intervene. Johnny could have laughed politely, redirected the conversation, or tossed out a joke of his own to release the pressure. Instead, he offered almost nothing. His expression remained controlled. His attention drifted toward the desk, and in the uncomfortable spaces between Jerry's remarks, Carson's pencil became strangely noticeable. Tap, tap, tap. It was almost like a countdown to the commercial break. Johnny wasn't trying to create comedy anymore. He seemed to be waiting for an escape route. And to understand why Jerry Lewis could behave so differently from the entertainer audiences thought they knew, you have to look beyond what was happening on stage. Because Jerry's body had been paying the price for his comedy for decades, Lewis hadn't built his career by simply standing behind a microphone telling jokes. His body was part of the act. He crashed into walls, threw himself across furniture, twisted his limbs into ridiculous positions, fell violently to the floor, and performed physical routines again and again for the perfect reaction. Audiences saw laughter. Jerry's body absorbed the damage. Years of physical comedy eventually contributed to serious back problems and chronic pain. The same performances that helped make him famous also left him searching for ways to function through that pain. And prescription medication became part of that story. Lewis later spoke publicly about his dependence on Percodan, a powerful opioid painkiller, during a difficult period of his life. By the 1970s, his relationship with pain medication had become a serious problem. That context makes his strange television appearances from this period far more complicated. Behind the tuxedo was a man dealing with physical agony, enormous professional pressure, and medication capable of altering behavior and judgment. Accounts surrounding Jerry during this era described dramatic changes in his personality, and speculation naturally followed whenever his public behavior became erratic. Some observers believed medication may have contributed to the unusual intensity viewers witnessed. Suddenly, the sweating, restless movements, unpredictable remarks, and distant expression looked less like ordinary nervousness. Jerry seemed physically present, but emotionally somewhere else. One moment he could appear completely confident, the next irritated, then strangely detached. His usual comedic instincts, the internal mechanism that told him when to push harder and when to retreat, seemed unreliable. That was particularly dangerous beside Johnny Carson. Carson's entire style depended on rhythm. He listened carefully, waited for openings, and guided conversations without making the audience notice what he was doing. But Jerry wasn't following the rhythm. He was fighting it. And Johnny seemed increasingly aware that traditional hosting techniques weren't going to solve the problem. There was another layer beneath Jerry's behavior as well: pride. For decades, Jerry Lewis hadn't merely been famous. He had been treated as a comedic genius. He wrote, directed, produced, performed, controlled sets, commanded enormous salaries, and became accustomed to being the most important person in almost every room he entered. Now he was sitting on Johnny Carson's stage. This was Johnny's room, Johnny's audience, Johnny's cameras. And when that audience failed to respond the way Jerry expected, something inside him appeared to tighten. The medication may have dulled his physical pain, but nothing could dull the humiliation of hearing silence where thunderous laughter once seemed automatic. What viewers were witnessing wasn't simply an interview going badly. It was a legendary performer struggling with pain, ego, changing times, and potentially the effects of the medication he had relied upon to keep functioning. The polished entertainer was disappearing. The frustration underneath was becoming visible, and the interview hadn't merely gone off the rails. The most disturbing part was still coming. The interview didn't simply fall apart. It crashed, burned, and then Jerry Lewis seemed determined to pour gasoline over what remained. Instead of recognizing that the audience had turned uncomfortable and pulling back, Jerry pushed harder. Somewhere along the way, he stopped behaving like Johnny Carson's guest and began acting as though he should be running the show himself. He interrupted Johnny in the middle of questions. He challenged the direction of the conversation. At moments, his responses carried the unmistakable suggestion that Carson's questions were either pointless or beneath him. And then Johnny's expression changed. Anyone familiar with Carson knew the look. The warmth disappeared from his eyes. His face remained calm, but the temperature seemed to drop several degrees. Johnny Carson rarely needed to shout when he was angry. Sometimes all he had to do was stare. Johnny could survive almost any difficult guest. He had interviewed celebrities who were drunk, boring, arrogant, unpredictable, or completely unwilling to cooperate. His genius was finding some way to turn their behavior into entertainment. But Jerry presented a different problem. He wasn't merely being difficult. He seemed determined to control the room. Instead of working with Johnny, Jerry appeared to be competing with him, interrupting, correcting, challenging, and trying to establish that he was still the biggest personality on the stage. But the harder he pushed, the worse it became. The audience began shifting nervously in their seats. These were people who had probably grown up laughing at Jerry Lewis, people conditioned to respond the moment he twisted his face or launched into one of his familiar voices. Now they barely knew how to react. They weren't watching Jerry Lewis command an audience. They were watching him struggle to get one back. And for perhaps the first time that night, the audience began looking toward Johnny rather than Jerry. They wanted Carson to rescue the situation, but even Johnny seemed unsure how. What made the appearance especially revealing was that it exposed a side of Jerry Lewis that ordinary moviegoers rarely encountered, but people inside Hollywood had discussed for years. The need for control. To understand why that mattered, remember who Jerry Lewis had become by the 1970s. He wasn't simply a comedian anymore. He had evolved into an extraordinarily powerful filmmaker, an actor, director, producer, writer, and creative force who exercised enormous authority over his productions. On a Jerry Lewis movie set, Jerry could control nearly everything. If he wanted another take, they did another take. If he wanted something changed, it changed. His obsessive approach to filmmaking was part of what made him innovative, but it also reinforced a world in which Jerry was accustomed to having the final word. For years, hundreds of people depended on his decisions. Then he walked on to The Tonight Show, and suddenly Jerry Lewis wasn't the man in charge. Johnny Carson was. It was Carson's desk, Carson's cameras, Carson's band, Carson's audience, and ultimately Carson's show. That difference seemed increasingly difficult for Jerry to accept. He interrupted instead of listening. He appeared to question Johnny's timing and direction. When the audience didn't respond enthusiastically enough, Jerry's frustration became increasingly visible. The lovable clown audiences remembered from the movies seemed to disappear. In his place was a complicated, demanding entertainer who desperately wanted control over an environment that didn't belong to him. That contrast was startling. For decades, Jerry's most famous screen persona had been almost childlike, the helpless troublemaker with the squeaky voice, crossed eyes, wild expressions, and impossible physical movements. But Jerry Lewis, the filmmaker, was nothing like that character. Behind the innocent clown was an intensely ambitious perfectionist who understood the entertainment business and expected enormous control over his work. And now, those two versions of Jerry seemed to collide in front of a national audience. The more the crowd withdrew, the harder he appeared to push. The harder he pushed, the quieter they became. It created a brutal cycle. Jerry wanted laughter because laughter confirmed that he still controlled the room. But his attempts to force that reaction only made everyone more uncomfortable. This was no longer simply comedy going wrong. It had become a power struggle, and Jerry was losing it. Finally, the stage manager gave the signal everyone seemed desperate to see. Commercial break. The camera light went dark. And almost immediately, the atmosphere changed. The audience could finally breathe. What had felt like an endless stretch of tension suddenly stopped, at least temporarily. But for Johnny and Jerry, there was no real escape. They were still sitting only feet apart. And Carson's reaction during these moments revealed just how badly the appearance had affected him. Johnny didn't appear eager to joke about what had happened. There was no playful handshake. No quick remark designed to reassure Jerry that everything was fine. Instead, Carson looked exhausted. That distinction matters because Johnny could become visibly combative when he wanted to. Years later, during famously tense appearances involving guests like Charles Grodin, Carson could sharpen his sarcasm and turn confrontation itself into entertainment. This felt different. With Jerry, there was history, there was friendship, and rather than looking like a host preparing to fight an obnoxious celebrity, Johnny looked like someone watching an old friend unravel and realizing there was very little he could do about it. The pencil remained in his hand. His eyes returned to the desk. The silence between them said more than another joke possibly could. And when the cameras eventually came back, the show had to continue because live television doesn't care whether friendships are collapsing. But something fundamental had changed. The consequences weren't announced publicly. NBC didn't immediately release some dramatic statement declaring Jerry Lewis permanently banned, and a star of his stature wasn't someone the network could simply erase overnight. The damage was quieter than that. Johnny Carson had seen something he couldn't forget. The audience had seen it too, and whatever trust had once existed between the two men had been badly wounded. The television appearance would eventually end. The fallout was only beginning. The easy chemistry was gone. The old boys' club banter, the playful insults, the unspoken trust that had once made Johnny Carson and Jerry Lewis so entertaining together, it had been replaced by caution. From that point forward, something stood between them. Jerry could still appear on television, and his relationship with Carson didn't simply disappear overnight. But the dynamic had changed. What once felt spontaneous now carried tension. Producers understood that Jerry could be unpredictable, while Johnny, a man who valued control more than almost anything in broadcasting, had been reminded of the danger that came with putting an unpredictable performer in front of live cameras. Because Carson's entire reputation depended on making chaos look controlled. Jerry had created chaos that Johnny couldn't easily turn into comedy. The bridge between the king of late night and the king of comedy wasn't necessarily destroyed, but it had been damaged badly enough that crossing it would never feel quite as comfortable again. And in many ways, that is what makes this chapter of Jerry Lewis's life so fascinating. It wasn't simply about bad jokes. It wasn't simply about an uncomfortable interview. It was about what happens when the public personality a celebrity has spent decades constructing suddenly collides with the private reality underneath it. For most of his career, Jerry Lewis had been remarkably good at keeping those two worlds separate. Audiences saw the clown. They saw the crossed eyes, the ridiculous voices, the collapsing body, the childish confusion, and the frantic physical comedy. They saw someone who seemed born to make people happy. What they didn't see was everything required to maintain that image. The injuries, the chronic pain, the relentless need to perform, the enormous ego that can develop after decades of being told you're a genius. And the medication Jerry later acknowledged had become a serious dependency during this difficult period of his life. The same body he had used as a comedy weapon was beginning to betray him. Every fall had eventually carried a price. Every collision with a wall, every exaggerated tumble, every violent physical routine had contributed to years of punishment. Jerry had spent much of his career turning pain into laughter, but eventually there was too much pain to hide. Medication offered relief. Then relief created another problem. Jerry later described becoming dependent on Percodan and eventually confronting the reality that the pills controlling his pain were also controlling his life. Getting away from them would become another brutal chapter in his story. But Jerry Lewis survived it, and that matters, because it would be easy to freeze him permanently inside the worst moments of his life and pretend that was the entire man. It wasn't. Jerry eventually overcame his dependency and continued working. His career changed, his public image evolved, and audiences gradually encountered a different Jerry Lewis, older, more complicated, and increasingly willing to discuss the suffering behind the comedy. Then came one of the most important performances of his later career. In 1982, Martin Scorsese cast Jerry opposite Robert De Niro in The King of Comedy. The choice was brilliant precisely because audiences carried decades of expectations about Jerry Lewis. But this time there was no nutty professor, no screaming childlike voice, no rubber-faced clown desperately searching for another laugh. Jerry played Jerry Langford, a famous late-night television host trapped by his own celebrity and surrounded by people desperate to enter his world. The irony was impossible to miss. Years after Jerry had struggled inside the controlled universe of Johnny Carson, he was now portraying a television king who understood exactly how exhausting fame, obsession, and public attention could become. And Jerry was excellent. The performance reminded people that beneath all the physical comedy was a serious actor capable of restraint, bitterness, vulnerability, and menace. But the contradictions never completely disappeared. Jerry Lewis could be generous and difficult, brilliant and exhausting, warm one moment and controlling the next. He could devote enormous energy to charitable causes while simultaneously developing a reputation among some colleagues for being extraordinarily demanding. That complexity is why reducing him either to a beloved comedy genius or to a Hollywood monster misses the larger story. He was both easier and harder to understand than either version, and Johnny Carson understood complicated entertainers better than almost anyone. Johnny spent 3 decades sitting across from famous people while America watched. He learned to recognize insecurity disguised as arrogance, fear disguised as hostility, and desperation disguised as comedy. Perhaps that is why the tension between these two men remains so interesting. Carson couldn't simply treat Jerry like another difficult celebrity. There was history between them. Johnny knew the entertainer. He also knew the man. And when someone you know begins behaving unpredictably in front of millions of viewers, there is only so much a television host can do. Could Johnny have interrupted? Certainly. Could he have forced the conversation somewhere safer? Perhaps. Could he have somehow rescued Jerry from himself? That is much harder to answer, because Carson wasn't Jerry's doctor, therapist, or guardian. He was the host of a television program trying to keep a difficult broadcast moving. Sometimes friendship means stepping in. Sometimes there is no way to step in without making the humiliation even worse. And sometimes all you can do is sit there, pencil in hand, waiting for the moment to pass. That is the haunting image at the center of this story. 2 legends, 2 enormous egos, 2 old friends sitting only a few feet apart. One desperately trying to maintain control, the other apparently losing it. Jerry Lewis spent decades mastering the ability to fall down and make America laugh. But this time, when he stumbled, there was no punchline waiting at the bottom. The silence revealed something audiences weren't accustomed to seeing, the human being behind the performance. Jerry would recover. He would work again, receive enormous honors, make new generations laugh, and leave behind an influence on comedy that remains impossible to deny. But moments like this complicate the legend, and perhaps they should. Hollywood history becomes much more interesting when its icons stop looking like perfect statues and start looking like human beings. Jerry Lewis was capable of extraordinary brilliance, but brilliance didn't protect him from pain, dependency, insecurity, or his own worst impulses. Johnny Carson was one of television's greatest hosts, but even Carson couldn't control everything happening on his stage. That's what makes this story linger. It wasn't simply the night a comedian bombed. It was a moment when the machinery of celebrity briefly stopped working, when laughter could no longer hide the tension underneath. And when millions of viewers caught a glimpse of just how complicated the man behind Jerry Lewis really was. So what do you think? Was Johnny Carson right to stay back and allow Jerry to face the consequences of his own behavior? Or should Johnny have recognized that his friend was struggling and stepped in before things went any further? And when you look at Jerry Lewis, do you see an entertainer whose ego finally overwhelmed him? A man desperately struggling through pain and dependency? Or some uncomfortable combination of both? Let me know your take in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this deeper look behind the polished image of Hollywood's biggest legends, make sure to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the stories still to come. There are plenty more forgotten feuds, uncomfortable interviews, broken friendships, and hidden chapters from Hollywood history waiting to be uncovered. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.